All right. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the panel series from Climate Farmers. This is where we go into depth about the topics of conversation that are the most important to our farmers in the Climate Farmers community. And today we're talking about the challenges and the benefits of collaborating with wildlife on farms. And we've got three great panelists today who are going to give us direct experience from their own farm practices in very diverse conditions. We've got Benjamin, who is calling in from California today. Is that correct?
Today I'm in California. Yes.
Yeah, normally he's with us here in Europe, but he had to go back to teach some courses. We've got Andy from Slovenia and Marco from Italy. So why don't we just start with some introductions, guys? Maybe Marco, can you start us off? Tell us a little bit about your operation and the role or the challenge that wildlife plays for you.
Yes, welcome to everybody. Thank you for hosting me. I'm Marco from Pulicaro Farm, and I run this farm with my wife since 20 years. We are in the central part of Italy on 120 hectares, and we mostly raise animals on pastures, so around 50 cows and 200 pigs and 15,000 birds per year, mostly. And we are on the border of a natural reserve, so we have plenty of wildlife. And I would like to share with you how to use this abundance, these tools for helping your farm and not feeling them as a challenge. Yes, maybe we go on with the other introductions.
Thank you so much, Marco. Andy, you want to give us a preview of your operation and how wildlife plays a role on your farm?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. Looking forward to sharing my experiences. I'll give you a rundown of our farm. We run a small family farm, me and my wife and her family. We have 10 hectares of land in 3 locations. 2 of them are right by the sea, by the coast of the Adriatic in the Mediterranean, on Slovenian coast. And we also have a hazelnut grove, which is about 7 kilometers away, very different environment down in a valley. We specialize in olive oil. The hazelnuts are still quite young, so they're not into full production yet. And we try to integrate with our local surroundings and try and get benefits from them. We produce about 2,000 liters of olive oil. So there's 4 hectares of olives in our site around the house. And then we have a new site, which is in another town. And that is just above a cliff. And that is quite rich with wildlife there. Our hazelnuts plantation is about 3 hectares. That is fenced to keep out certain wildlife. Some wildlife is good, some wildlife is less friendly. And that is in the valley where we try to farm in a little bit different way. Olives like very dry, warm slopes, and hazelnuts like more moisture, deeper soils. So we have quite a few different environments on the farm. Our surrounding natural environment is generally farmland, small terraces, quite diverse crops, a few little patches of woodland. We don't have very much on the Slovenian coast, but below us we have 750 hectare salt pans. So this is a Ramsar wetland for migratory birds, and it has an effect and interaction with the farm.
Fantastic. Yeah. I was there earlier this year and got to see that diversity firsthand. It's incredible the complexity that you're managing there and some of the experimental things that you have closer to your house. Now let's go to Benjamin. Now, Benjamin, I don't even know where to start with your introduction. You are involved with so many different things, from your own experience in farming, as well as designing and setting up farms for other people and consulting for other operations. I'll let you give your own introduction and tell us about how you relate with wildlife on your operations and your clients.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm the wildlife on the farm. Thank you, Oliver, and it's great to be here and share a little bit about what I do and the operations that I'm involved in. Like you said, I've been a farmer, more small scale market garden, vegetables and fruit. And then over the years, I've gotten more involved in perennial systems. About 15 years ago, I got involved in urban agriculture in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I started replicating production systems onto rooftops and in urban settings in a built environment, which was actually gave me a very deep insight to farming with nature, because in the urban setting, there's no space that's really designed for nature. And so how do we rewild our urban centers? And in that, it deepens, again, another layer of working with and farming for nature. in that regard by creating wildlife corridors into dense urban settings. Now, I'm in California right now, in Northern California, north of Sacramento, towards on the foothills of the Sierras at about 2,000 feet. I'm here. I've been here for about a year on this project. So I do design and build farms. I have a lot of experience mostly in Central California on the coast, but have over the last number of years have been consulting and then designing. And so I'm currently here finishing out this or working with this project. And these are all, I think what's interesting when we look at the farms, it's an evolution, it's a succession of evolution from where we enter the timeline. But then there's everything that happens afterwards and the ways in which we contribute to the ecosystem. And so for me, the wild doing these consultations, doing these designs is really relearning, unlearning, and re-educating people around what a farm is. Also connecting with what was here before, and that the indigenous native peoples of lands were cultivating and farming with the wild in that sense and tending the wild. And so then it like opens up a whole discussion. I think that we might discuss a little bit too about what is farming and what is the farm and what is the garden. And so most of the scale, to kind of go with what Andrew was saying, I try to relate to hectares. We are in acres over here, but I got a good orientation with it. This is about a 15-hectare farm with only about 5 hectares that would be reserved for growing and cultivation. The rest is more open and for the wild. It's a sanctuary preserve for people to reconnect to the lands, but with that, it's all beans. And so these clients are really committed and connected to that. It's an old Rudolf Steiner site. They've been doing BD preps here for about 30 years with the Rudolf Steiner's College in Sacramento. So it has a really energetic charge to the property, which is something we've discussed too, but I'll leave it at that. That's my introduction. I also work for the Regenerative Organic Alliance that we talked about in one of your other podcasts that does certifications. And I think that's an interesting thing of how we measure and validate some of these efforts with ecosystem services, which usually are underrepresented and undervalued on the farm.
Indeed, and having biodiversity metrics in that as well, given the fact that it's usually not paid attention to, and this is why we're talking about it today, because this does have the potential to not only be valued by the people who are buying the products, but also the farmers who are cultivating the space and the beings around and creating relationships in between them. So Marco, let's come back to you, and maybe you can give me some specific examples of how you were working with and maybe managing some of the challenges of the wildlife that is so close to your farm and in many cases integrated in with the operation.
Yes, of course. And yes, as I was telling you, my farm focuses on animals on pasture. So the first thing that comes to everyone's mind is the interaction with the predators. So we have wolves, we have photo traps that recorded groups, a pack of wolves until 12, 13, 11 wolves at once. We don't have bears in this area. But we have also obviously all the smaller predators like foxes and others. And yes, this is maybe the first thing that comes to my mind. And I want to tell you that since the wolves increased their presence here in the last 15 years, my work is easier. My work is easier because using the livestock guardian dogs, I noticed a reduction of diseases that can pass from the wildlife to the sheep, the goats, to the cow or whatever, especially with the birds as well, from wild birds to the chickens and so on. Why I'm telling this looks like a little bit provocative, but what I would like to share with you guys is that if you try to really embrace the nature that surrounds your farms and try to make your farm part of this wider ecosystem, you will have much more advantages compared to troubles. I cultivate some olives, not maybe so many as Andrew, but in this part of Italy can be quite challenging, a pest that is called fly of the olives. And usually, a lot of times, yes, it's not just the chickens and the turkeys that are roaming under the olive orchard, but is also the wildlife that doesn't allow a species to become predominant, to become too much invasive. I think it's all about this. To promote biodiversity is to avoid that a species, no matter if it is a plant or an animal, can become too much challenging for your farm. Obviously, at the basement of this assumption, we have to consider that we must increase the lives in our farm, all the lives. So also the wildlife farm. This means that you should reduce pesticide or avoid completely any kind of pesticide, any kind of insecticide. I want to make another example. I have sheep and goats and cow. They mostly doesn't have any tick. You know the ticks? But we have sometimes till 50 wild birds, white birds, that I don't know the name in English, honestly, that lives constantly with the herd, and they go picking every single insect from the back or from the neck or from the tail of the cow. And obviously, if they get poisoned by the eventually poison that the insecticide they can use in my farm, they will be poisoned. The poison will go into the circle of the ecosystem, and you will not have these birds anymore, or you will decrease their number. So I think that this is mostly the point. Trying to survive the first years of this shift, and trusting the balance that the enhanced biodiversity will bring to your farm. This for being very synthetic.
These are fantastic examples of how once a system starts to reach more of an equilibrium, more of a balance, I mean, nature has solved all of these problems that we consider pests or weeds or whatever in the past, and not through extermination, through balance and presence of diversity that creates a system that self-regulates. And you're really seeing the benefits of that in parasite control on the livestock or reduction in diseases that come in because the predators are present. Andy, can you give us some examples of how, as you've embraced a collaboration with wildlife, whether that be insect, animal, plant, or otherwise, you've started to see these things balance out and reap some of the benefits?
Yeah, definitely. Probably the easiest one, and one that everybody can probably relate to. We're a perennial farmer, so we've got the olives and the hazelnuts. These are generally pretty tough plants, but they do get attacked by pests, as Marco said, to the olive fly. We do actually have to treat for the olive fly. We do have problems with it. So we haven't managed to get to that equilibrium of not needing to treat, but we do that in a very controlled and careful way. We monitor exactly what's happening, so we know where the problem is. But to try and combat this fly, we do have wildlife corridors around the edges of our lots of olives. Here it's very small parcels of land. So there's always a boundary. There's a road boundary, there's a neighbor boundary, a bank, a wall. So there's all these opportunities to incorporate natural habitat. Also useful things for the plant, for the farm, and also productive things. Wildlife likes diversity, as we were talking about. So we have a strip next to the road. The road is collapsing slightly. It's a very small tract to one house. To stabilize it, we planted typical Mediterranean herbs, but we also included plants that are particularly good for parasitic wasps, which will attack the olive fly, the grub inside the olive, and kill the olive larvae. But we don't know how successful that is. We don't treat very much, and we don't have such a bad problem with olive fly. So I think it is beneficial. However, there is other ways that I've seen wildlife help us. For example, in winter, there's always a few olives that you miss on the tree, and that is the reservoir for this olive fly for the following year. These olives can stay on the tree for until springtime, or maybe when we're pruning, we'd even prune a few off that have been missed on a branch. But I've noticed near the house where we have a couple of olive trees that we never managed to pick the very top ones. And I was watching the great tits. I don't know the Latin name for this. It's an English name for a little bird that lives in our woodlands and in our gardens. but it was going around and picking out the grubs of the infected olive flies, or the infected fruit, and it was actually cleaning up. So to try and promote that over a period of maybe 20 years, we've been putting up bird boxes in the olive grove. We have quite young trees. They're only 30 to 35 years old, so they haven't got big cavities for these birds to nest in. And yes, birds come and go and they spend time in the olive grove, maybe at different seasons, but they weren't breeding there. So we put up these nest boxes for this particular bird. And we now have, I think, 5 families that have just left the nest in the olive grove. And I was watching them the other day, and they're working through the olive grove and they're just searching the trees. And these birds have amazing eyesight and are very clever. So if they find a tree, for example, that's got caterpillars on it, they will come back and clear the whole tree because they have a lot of hungry babies at home to feed. And it's a very simple thing to do, but it seems very effective. And these birds never stop. From dawn to dusk, they're going at this time of year. They will probably produce 2 broods, and they're very useful for this caterpillar control. If you've got any fruit trees, hazelnuts, a few of them get attacked by caterpillars. I need more boxes there, so I can see there's a gap I've got to fill there. But this is a good example of where wildlife actually acts as a balancing force against the problem species that are really proliferating in the olives.
Brilliant, man. That's such a good example of working both with plants, insects, and animals to attack this from a number of different ways and creating habitat instead of necessarily bringing something in the way so many of these types of introductions of wildlife in order to control something have been mismanaged in the past. If you give the habitat, they will come on their own, and you're starting to see the benefits already. Now, of course, there will be challenges. You only have about 10 hectares of the olives and the hazelnuts and such. And so on that scale, it can be difficult to have a big impact on, let's say, the migration patterns or wildlife corridors. So small scale can sometimes be difficult when managing biodiversity in the region. Have you collaborated with other people in your area who see value in what you're doing as well?
Collaborated. Other farmers are interested in what we're doing, and they do look at what we've done. We also get paid as well by Europe to put up the bird boxes and cut every second row every 6 weeks. So there's a regime of cutting the grass. We don't actually cut the grass in the olives anyway. That was one thing I stopped doing as soon as we took over the farm from my mother-in-law. We cut it at a time of mulching. So we smash up all the branches, leave them on the ground. Then the grass is left to grow. So we have about half of the olive grove is mulched at the moment with debris lying on it and regrowing. And then the other half, generally under the trees, has got really quite tall grass under it. That's also a habitat for particularly grasshoppers and invertebrates. And here that is very valuable habitat. It produces a lot of biomass from just these insects living there. So we find that's really a positive impact. And I discovered that by destroying something and realizing how many grasshoppers I was killing at the time. When I mulched some long grass in the middle of July, there was potentially kilos of or pounds of insects in the grass that I was mulching. Yeah, they became fertilizer, but they could have been a lot more effective being alive, eating and pooping and eating each other.
Sure. Very interesting. All right, let's go back to Benjamin. Can you give me some concrete examples from your experience on the different operations you've worked in of integrating wildlife of many different types for the benefit of the operation?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Andrew a question first. How long have you been incorporating these like beneficial insect habitat on your farm?
It started with my mother-in-law, but I've always been involved in it. I was actually trained as a landscape architect, and so was my wife. So we spent a lot of time regenerating damaged areas, maybe next to rivers, watercourses. And we worked in Australia for a while. So there it's very heavy sort of engineering of the land before the houses are built. So then there's the repair of those areas and constant environmental damage. So you have to repair things. So we've been doing it personally for 14 years on the farm.
On the farm. So I think one of the things that you spoke to, which I think is something that gets overlooked or undervalued, the farmer as observers and the observations that the farmer makes through next to the house, in the fields, doing the mowing, and it's at the smaller scale that those observations become more particular because you are able to slow down and you're observing at a certain, you have a certain capacity to take that information in, adjust, and then work with nature. We often say there's a great book and festival actually happening next month in Ireland, Farming for Nature. And if those who don't know that resource, it's a really great example of many different farms that are farming for nature. And that's a different perspective. And I think for me, some of the best examples are when we actually shift our orientation on the farm and we look at the farm as an ecosystem and that we're farming for that. We're actually building one of my first teachers, and he said, you're not building a farm, you're building an ecosystem. And the farm is like the unknown good benefit from that. You're getting food from it, you're getting all these things, but really it's an ecosystem that's functioning and how you collaborate with that. And so some examples, these are both great examples that were given. I think the other thing that's really important to note is the interconnectedness of nature. And when you do one thing, how it has a ripple effect because everything is connected. And so just by the unknown good benefit of leaving those olives because you just couldn't get to them all, and then that would attracting the birds. And I would push back on the scale of impact with, even though the 20 hectares seems like a small scale, it's an island of diversity. It's a refugia of diversity. And we know that diversity creates stability. And so creating that stability, and I say that so much because in the urban environment, we're talking about an eighth of a hectare, a quarter of a hectare. We're talking about a very small space, but you create that island for migratory birds and they come and then you have this, and then they start creating. So I think for me, the biggest examples and things I've seen is when given the space, I think, I don't know if it was Marco or Andrew, you said like creating the corridors on the wildlife corridors. And some of those times it's on the top of the trees. Other times it's just where we put the fence. And so on a farm I was at for the last 4 years, we had to put up the perimeter fence. In California, we have heavy deer predation. And so you have to put up these big tall fences. And we were putting the fence around the production area, which was about 5 hectares. And it bordered up against the riparian zones. And right along the edge where you would think you would put the fence, there was a highway. And it was through observation and it was through going out there at sunrise or in the early morning with your coffee and seeing the critters and also observing what's happening, that there was this massive highway coming from the mountain down to the creek. And it was right along the edge. And we know that that edge is the ecotone where you have a lot of diversity. And so this was the edge of the field, the edge of the riparian zone. And it was a massive highway of deer, foxes, rabbits, tons of rabbits, and mountain lion, bobcat. I mean, lots of activity on this trail. And we said, let's pull our fence back 1.5 meters. Let's pull it back. And then we said, let's actually pull it back 2 meters so we can bring the flail mower on the tractor and kind of keep a barrier there. And we pushed the edge back a little bit. But then we said, okay, yes, and let's create a kind of a finger of that wild riparian zone into the farm. So even though we didn't, and then it's like, we want to block the sector of the deer because we don't want them in the gardens. But we want to bring all the other diversity, the birds, the insects, and same, we get grants with Wild Farm Alliance based in here in California for hedgerows, nesting birds, raptor perches. In the States, we have environmental quality incentive programs, EQIP grants that help fund these ecosystem services. And so as farmers, you're like, well, as we're designing this and building it out and say, okay, we're going to give up some of our production space for nature. And which was like the best thing we could have done, because then by doing that, the deer had their access. They had their thing. They didn't need to jump over the fence. They weren't blocked. So that corridor stayed. And then we said, well, with this, we put in these keyline swales coming out. And along that, we said, let's plant those with that same diversity but specifically designed hedgerow of natives that pollinate at all different times, so that we always have a nectar source for all beneficial insects. And they're already there. in the scattered pattern of nature, but let's actually design it out and bring that out. And what that did is it created a habitat, which is what I think we're all getting to, is like we have to give some of our land for habitat, because when nature participates, that resiliency of the farm starts to proliferate. And that's why I was asking Andrew how long, because it's usually at the beginning, there's a climactic phase. You build the farm. Yeah, I asked about gophers earlier. We like clear the thing. All of a sudden the gophers, they show up by year 2. They're like there. They know there's water, there's veggies, and these are underground rodents that decimate olives and trees and everything once they take up habitat. And they peak, and for like 2 or 3 years, it's a big problem. But then whether you put up the owl box or you create the habitat for the gopher snakes, in year 4 or 5, you start to see a decrease. And then by year 7, there starts to become a balance. And it usually takes about 6 or 7 years to get to that place of nature starting to create some stability. Now, it could take a lot longer, or it could be shorter based on the farmer's participation, because there's an ecological engine that we can assist. And I think that's been my biggest benefit of collaboration with nature, is like when you start to understand the cyclical opportunity of nature's cycles, and you say, oh, I'm going to assist the water cycle by accentuating its capacity with this earthwork, or I'm going to increase the carbon cycle by doing a more aggressive approach to cover cropping. And you might do that at the beginning to accelerate and kind of kickstart the engine. That's kind of like chiropractic work. You got to get it in line, or you got to jumpstart, resuscitate. Because often we're taking farms that have not been managed in this way. And the soil is either dead, depleted, sometimes fumigated and everything. And you have to come in, and for the first couple of years, 2-3 years, usually a 3-year cycle, there's a resuscitation of nature's systems. And in that, you're going to have all kinds of pests and pestilence and things, but then it will create a balance, and you can assist. And then those are all learning and observational things. The weeds, the bugs, they're indicators of something. They're indicators of depletion. They're indicators of low bricks. They're indicators of less minerals, lack of boron, but it's the observation that the farmer needs. And cultivating that observation is the key tool, because nature is probably our most valuable ally, valuable farm worker that doesn't take time off. You don't pay anything. It's like it's constantly there. And you can't, how do you value a hummingbird? How do you value the pollinators? How do you value these birds eating on the top? It's like they're not coming in for a paycheck or anything, but they're working and they're doing their job, which is amazing. So it's like that relationship, I think, has been the greatest example of farming for nature and with nature.
Man, I love those observations, and you teed up the next question perfectly, because I would like to get a greater insight into this observational and learning journey from each one of you. Now, I remember a specific moment when I was out in the field with Marco when we were looking at an olive orchard at an event that we did in Italy a couple years ago. And this is when I realized the depth of the ecological knowledge that this guy has, when he was telling me the story about the different types of ants that were working in that olive orchard and what they indicated about the quality of the soil. And a quote that I got from you, Marco, that I've used many times before or since then is, ants are the earthworms of drylands. And you studied ants specifically. Was it through a biology degree? Anyway, tell me more about the knowledge of ecology that you came into the farm with, and your learning and observation journey that's helped you curate the ecosystem that you're currently managing now.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I have a degree in ecology, and my thesis was about recognizing patterns into ants community for describing environments that was chemically attacked or mechanically disturbed, or more clean, more respected. And yes, I think that what Benjamin was saying about the ability, the time, the patience for observing is something essential. And it's something I want to add that is difficult to find in our society in general. Now, maybe we are always in rush, maybe, I don't know, we are overstimulated, but the patience, the time for looking is something, for example, that I always ask to the wonderful team I have here in Pulicaro, the guys that work with me, I always tell them, please, 10 minutes, get bored and just look around you. Look at the animals, look at the grass, look at everything is around you, because it's important to be conscious of what is going on. And another thing to add is that I try to apply in my farm this rule. If I'm not sure that I'm completely understanding what is around me, better to do not act. Don't do it. Don't do anything. If you're not sure, don't do it. It's better to wait and see what happens. Yes,
Agreed.
Thank you. About this, I always make an example in the olive orchard where I have a big oak tree that is more or less quite in the middle of the olive orchard. And when I planted these olives that were very little, small plants, the first thing that some friends and neighbors told me, oh, you have to cut it off this oak because this oak will make shade on the young olives and will be difficult to turn around with the tractor and so on. That are all things that are right, correct. But it's just a part of the picture. And this is exactly to me, which is the shift of minding that we need for understanding and for using more nature. Here in Pulicaro, 6 months per year is too hot for having animal in the pasture. No matter if they are turkeys or chickens or sheep, it's too hot. It's simply too hot to stay in the sun. And that oak tree is true. She kept a pressure on 7 plants of this orchard. That is an orchard that have more or less 200 olive trees. But this oak allowed me to keep the animal grazing, my livestock animals grazing, and adding manure to the plants, and really improving the quality of the soil and controlling the birds, especially controlling the pest of the olives, and adding complexity to the microbiota and all these nice things. And so what I always say that it's true that oak tree ruined 7 trees, because it is, but she helped another 193 trees to grow. This is to me the difference, what is the biggest difference. And I would like to add another thing about, because we are speaking about the animals. When we speak about wildlife, yes, our mind goes mostly to animals, and mine also. At the same time, I think that it's extremely important to recognize the power, the extreme power of the grasslands, the permanent grasslands, where you can find a lot of plants are nutraceutic that are extremely useful for the animals that lives on. I had some pastures in my farm where I started my regenerative journey at the beginning. So now almost 20 years that I'm managing as best as I can and so on, are pens and area where I put the animals that are in trouble, where I put a group of birds that are not 100%, where I put the lamb that doesn't get enough milk or whatever. Cause now it's complicated, but through the microbiota that will tell them which plant to pick, they can really treat themselves. They self-heal themselves. And this is an amazing result that needs time. This is, again, according on what Benjamin and Andrew were saying, we need time. What I want to say is that we don't need a lifetime. We need years, between 5, 8, 16 years. Yes. Compared to our usual business timeline is a lot of time. Yes, but we are farmers and we know that we have just one spring per year, no matter what we say, no matter what we want. So yes, these are the things that really impress me more during this year.
I love that you mentioned the relationship between the livestock and their ability to self-medicate. I really like the reference of the book Nourishment by Fred Provenza,
Yes.
who did a ton of study on this. I had him on an earlier version of the podcast a number of years ago, and the research done about mostly goats and their ability to find exactly what they need given their life cycle, given their health needs. And by allowing them this freedom rather than constantly pushing them or feeding a certain thing, you can avoid so many of the problems that we otherwise then have to medicate or treat in another way. As you're saying, giving them the opportunity and the freedom to take care of themselves and behave in the way that they know how to do.
Yes, you have to allow them to be free to roam, but you must provide a biodiverse ecosystem. Because if
Yeah.
you seed clover, a wonderful clover, you will have a wonderful clover dot. You will not have another 70 species.
Yeah.
Can treat the animals, that can heal the animals by themselves. So it's both these things.
Indeed. And many of these species you would never think to plant, or maybe you wouldn't even be able to get seeds for. And unless you are cultivating a system that allows them to come up where the environment is right for their presence, as well as integrating and managing the livestock that go through there in a way that enhances their life cycle rather than eradicating them. I've also seen the other thing be true, where noxious weeds or things that can inhibit the growth of cattle or cause them problems are disfavored through proper management that favors then the foods and the medicines that those animals need over time. But like you said, time is a crucial element in this, and certain things can't be forced. And when you do try and force them, on the other side, there are many disadvantages for having taken a shortcut. Andy, I want to go to you now, and I know you as a relentless tinkerer. You are the mad scientist of your farming area, and I appreciate you for it. Can you tell me about your own observations and constant learning journey that has helped bring about the insights and the management that you told us about earlier?
Yeah, I try to take time to see what's going on around me. I actually like wildlife. I like the outside. I'm quite curious by things, and new species appear every year on the farm, or I haven't noticed them before. So yeah, I'm always excited by that. But yeah, observation sometimes takes time, and sometimes you get it totally wrong. We have olives that are ripe at sort of the end of September, October time, and they'll stay ripe on the trees until maybe March, April time the following year if you don't pick them. What I guess was traditionally happening, we get lots of migratory birds through here, and starlings, they're very well known in Europe. These birds, they're mostly insectivorous, but they're quite happy to eat fruit and your fruit off trees and anything that they can find. What used to happen, they'd come across the Alps, migrating south, and if it was really cold in the north of Europe, they'd be coming here very hungry, and then they'd land in our olive trees full of these lovely black berries, full of protein and energy, and gorge themselves. So I used to spend several days watching what was going on and going out with a old pillow that was full of feathers, because an old farmer told me, yeah, if you go around and throw a load of feathers around the field, it really freaks the birds out because they think there's been lots of birds killed there and they move on. It does seem to work until the rain comes and makes all your feathers stick to the ground and then they don't see them anymore. So I was looking at a longer plan and going back to what Marco was saying about trees in the olive grove. I don't plant in the middle of our olive grove. It's all established. It was established well before I had anything to do with the farm. But at the edge and at key spots, I've tried to plant large trees or trees that will potentially grow to large trees and be predator trees. Because what I'm really needing on this farm is the large bird predators, just to keep things under control, keep these birds moving when they're a problem. Because I don't mind losing a bit of fruit, but I don't want to lose everything. This is my living, so I'm defensive of it a bit. It's a manageable amount. So in the future, we'll hopefully have 10, 15, 10-meter trees, possibly. Maybe not in my lifetime, but those will be the predator trees and they will keep these birds moving. But later on, I've already planted these trees and some of them are useful for timber, some are useful for nuts. But I was watching these starlings now and they're actually quite useful in the olive grove. They're going through on the ground. There's normally one or two on the tree, which are the lookouts, and they're pinching a few berries, but that's fair enough. The other 100 are on the ground, running around, picking up insects, worms. They're sticking their beaks in the ground. So they're not actually a problem. The only time that they seem to be a problem is when there's really cold weather and they're having a hard time. That's when they become a problem. However, with our climate changing, our environment's changing, I've noticed their behavior has changed as well. So these starlings used to just come for the autumn. They'd be here for a little bit, maybe into winter. And as it got colder here, they'd head further south. But after about 4 years of us being here, so that's about 10 years ago, I noticed that one or two of these pairs had stayed for the summer. And they were actually breeding in an old bird box that the woodpecker had made the hole bigger so they could get in. And then I noticed they had one lot of babies, then they had another lot of babies, and then they had 3 broods that year. And these things also like fruits. So it's really not a good area for them to be in if you're a farmer, but they didn't exist before. I don't know why. They used to migrate through, but they didn't stay. Now they stay and they're developing quite large flocks here. So they're becoming a problem for the grape growers. And if you have figs, they will start attacking those. So I'm hoping in the long run for any other of our smaller crops, more like home production, that these predator trees will help balance that out because they will take out some of those birds, keep the numbers down, keep them moving on so they do limited damage to my crops.
Fantastic. And in looking forward and making these investments, obviously you can't predict who or what is going to nest there. Or in planting these trees, it might be after your tenure on that farm that they reach the height. These are very long-term investments. How do you make the decision as to whether or not to put more or less energy into these things?
It's if I've got time at the right time of year to get that tree in the ground or get to the shop to buy it. So yeah, it might not be in the most calculated and planned way. It's right, let's do it now, let's go for it. If I make a mistake with a tree, there's always the chainsaw and we'll remove it. So it's better just to go for it and try it and see what happens. You build it and nature will come and people will come to what you do as well. So yeah, I'm not really that fearful of that. So we just try to do it as we go. Some years are more successful at creating a habitat for our wildlife or making a positive impact on the farm. Sometimes it's a learning curve and it all goes wrong.
Sure. There's a lot of trial and error, and goodness knows we have to be humble in our very limited understanding of beautiful and complex systems. And we've got about
Exactly.
10 minutes left before I want to hand it over to our listeners to take the questions. So maybe we can do a speed round of advice or maybe things to expect, given what we've talked about of the necessity of observing and realistic expectations of the amount of time that these things might take. How would you give some advice or help another farmer along their journey of integrating wildlife, biodiversity into their farm, what to expect and what to look out for? Benjamin, you want to start us off?
I was just saying, I love what Andrew said about that, looking at the long-term investment in planting the trees and having that good intention and going, okay, that should work. We'll see what happens. We also noticed that like you do need, sometimes you need some more immediate support of the troops to come in and help with those migratory boards. And again, the Wild Farm Alliance provides us over here with a lot of resources and doing raptor perches that are a 10-meter tall pole with a very specific perch can, even though it's not a natural thing, it's as a tree is, sometimes the clear view, if there's no branches, there's no stuff, it provides an incredible perch for some of those raptors that like the hawks and the falcons and stuff. They love sitting on those. We put 3 of those. We had a farm and we put 1 in each field. And within a week, they were there, just like scanning the field for mice and things. And they do have a huge presence with other migratory birds. The one thing I wanted to also just bring up, because I saw Roberto here from Portugal on the fall. And also when I was in Portugal, give me a shout out to João Valentim at Monte Severa, with some of the work they do in the growing of their field crops. And like half of the story that we haven't even talked about is what's happening underneath the soil. And the diversity and wild connection of that soil microbiome and the ways that through our management, through our planting, through our cover cropping, through our techniques, we can also assist that engine and ramp that up. And when we have a stable soil that's robust and wild, and like there's a whole mystery going on there too that we can't, you can get the microscope out and check out the soil food web and everything, but there's also minerals and mystery and all kinds of stuff happening there. And because we can't see it, we sometimes take it for granted, but it is the foundation that we're building all of this on. And so the ways that we can accentuate, inoculate, and participate within that layer, there's great examples all over within Climate Farmers, ERA, and stuff that are doing these practices. So highly encourage anyone listening or who listens to this to follow some of these farmers who, it's not no-till. Tillage can actually help in different settings and timing, but it's a management practice of your soil health. And that is a whole part of farming for nature as well.
Fantastic. Those are some great insights there. And definitely, like you said, there are very inspiring examples within our community and people that you can talk with through the WhatsApp group and through the community if you want to get direct advice from people. Let's go back to Marco.
Pictures.
And pictures. Pictures are worth
Yeah, I'm
1,000
sending
words,
videos.
right?
I mean, Roberto's on here. He's like always said it. He's like, I'm doing this. Check it out. You're like, whoa, bro,
Oh,
what you
man.
doing? It's so great.
Yeah. And Roberto is a rock star
Inspiring.
on that channel.
So
Marco,
so
back to you,
inspiring.
my man. Can you give us some advice for other farmers who are looking to integrate more wildlife and biodiversity onto their operations?
Honestly, I think that it is something very specific, context specific, obviously. But yes, I agree with Benjamin about the soil is essentially where everything starts. And he was speaking about the edges. Edges are really essential, especially in some kind of environments where woodlands and forests are not so common. So edges, or even if they are 3 meters, 2 meters, where you don't disturb nature, it is very important. And again, I think that one of the most important advice is to stop moving your hands when you don't understand what's going on. Because nature will teach you, will tell you what to do. Seriously. Now, another thing that I suggest to other farmers is to, according on their own lifestyle needings and everything, to introduce animals in the farms. Livestock can be chickens, can be a little group of turkeys, can be few cows, whatever. But all of us, we are currently living in environments where we separated plants and animals, and this doesn't exist in nature. There's no natural environment where you have just plants or just animals. And so every single place is different. Probably where Benjamin is now in California is so different from where I am, but we need plants and animals. So if farmers can somehow, even with a neighbor, introduce more complexity, so introducing animals in their own farm, this can be very important, I think.
Fantastic. The shorthand for not doing something right away that I really like is don't just do something, stand there. To flip that around from the common saying. Andy, to you, give us some insights as to what you've learned here and what advice you might give to someone starting on the journey of wildlife and biodiversity integration.
First one, I think, is follow up on what Marco said, and Benjamin, you've got to watch, you've got to observe. That's your first thing. Sit down, have a cup of tea, have a drink, and just look around and take the place in. Secondly, was probably to look at your local areas that's where wildlife habitat has already existed or is forming. Take ideas from there, especially species that you can use on the farm as edges, as windbreaks, possible fodder crops. Any use for those, it's definitely worth using something from your bioregion. And then the third one is probably the easiest, be a bit messy. Don't be too tidy. Everybody wants nice cut grass and wants to trim all the grass. I won't cut grass under my olives when I harvest them, but for the rest of the year, it can be quite scruffy, which is good habitat. It's also woody biomass for the grasses to be mulched later to go back and feed the soil and feed the worms, because that is incredible what the worms do in the autumn when they come back to life after keeping out of the heat and the dry soil at the surface. We also pile up some wood around, so we always have some prunings, so we'll pile wood around. And at the moment, there's a beetle that's quite busy devouring some of this old wood around. So it's recycling it. It's a source of food for some insectivorous bird as well. So yeah, be a little bit messy. You don't have to have everything messy. We obviously like areas to be a bit more tidy, but at the edges in particular, production is production sometimes, and that really ties you to certain ways of managing a part of the land. But I'm sure there's an area where the tractor turns around, there's a strange shaped bit of land on the end. Use these and then try and, if possible, link them to other areas, and you'll double the impact. The bigger the area, the better, but we don't always have this. Benjamin was saying earlier that he's had great success in urban areas where you think of it as pretty wildlife depleted. But if you have the habitat, they do find their way there, creatures. I went to London in the Natural History Museum and they've got frogs in their garden there. And it's like, how did they get there? Everything's bitumen around you, everything's hard surface, but they did get there. So yeah, build it and they will come. Be a little bit messy and look around, see what's locally is successful, what is happening, where are the animals living, and see if you can replicate that.
I love that, especially the messy part. Not only does it just make me feel better when I'm not on top of everything, but also I think that's just a general attitude shift that so many places, especially the farms that I see around me in Spain, could use. There's the misconception that una granja, una finca limpia, something clean, is something dead, where there's just nothing growing except for the single cultivar or the one species that you decide not to kill. And it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of our role in the ecosystem, back to how Benjamin was describing it earlier. And I think
Yeah,
that's a
it
really
also
good, go ahead.
it also saves you work. It's like we've got enough work. Oh, that looks nice. Looking at your fruit, Benjamin. But yeah, it does save us work. So why do you want to do something when we've got enough other things to do, which could be more fun and more profitable?
Yeah. Especially if you're caught up in this idea that your tasks are mostly killing or setting things back. That is, goes back to this misunderstanding of the role. But that is the perfect place to hand things over to our listeners. So we've got 30 minutes for you guys to ask our panelists anything you'd like. You can either continue with your questions in the chat and I'll read them off for you. Otherwise, I will give priority to people who raise their hand digitally just because it's easier for me to see you. So go ahead. I'll hand it over to you guys now.
There is a question in the chat from Alfredo about wolves.
Do you want to go here? I'll read that off for people who will later be listening to this on the podcast. So Alfredo asks, Pulicaro Farm, the wolves exist naturally in your region in Italy, or have they been reintroduced by rewilding? In his area, and Alfredo, I know you're in Portugal, the last wolves in his area disappeared more than 50 years ago. Do you know about the story of how the wolves have reestablished in your area, Marco?
Yeah, yes, I know. Wolves never disappeared completely from Italy. They stayed also constantly in Abruzzo and in Calabria, some mountain regions. And they widen the habitat according on how much the people left countryside. So after people abandoned fields and villages, and what was a farmland became again woodland or forest or bushland or whatever, slowly the wolves raised in number. And more recently, they came, but by themselves from Slovenia and from through Slovenia from Eastern Europe. But they didn't been introduced in our area and in Italy in general. So this is what happened here.
Go ahead, Benjamin.
I just wanted to add, because I think something Marco pointed out and in that question is as we've developed and farmed and done stuff, we've pushed nature into these islands of refugia, these places where they are able to exist and they've kind of taken refuge. And this whole rewilding of how do we create habitat to introduce or to bring back out is a very valuable part because we can see how nature will support the more resiliency within the whole environment and the ecosystem. But I'd like to suggest that in the way we design our farms can be this refugia. Our farms are places especially with the seeds and the trees and the biological diversity with these bioregional adaptation because of climate. And we're going through a very challenging climactic time. Climate farmers, here we are, that this next 50 years is going to be a real important time as a species of how we evolve and move and grow from. And that we have this opportunity right now because of the access and because of the knowledge and because of the technology that we can consciously develop and design these places to be these refuge, not only for wildlife, which is important, not only for the seeds and bioregionally adapting genetics of trees and things, but also for stories and community and people. Because in the end, that's what we're really doing. We're creating these hubs of resilience for community. And we all have to eat, and we want to eat good and clean and nourishing. And so how we do that and gather, and the whole slow food idea of celebrating these pleasures of the table. I've been involved in slow food for a long time, and I used to say it's seasonal, local, organic, and wild. The slow, right? It is slowing it down, but it's that type of relationship that we need to cultivate. And so it's a different way of looking at designing and building farms. But when we consciously say, oh yeah, I'm building a refugia within my farm, and this is for the next 100 years, it puts a scale of perspective of when Andrew's like, I'm going to plant this tree. And you're like, well, that's a long-term investment. And you're like, damn straight it is. I'm putting that tree in the ground. You put your stake in the ground. It's like, I put my tree in the ground to say like, this is an island. This is a place that, and we saw it with COVID. As soon as everyone was in lockdown, all of a sudden the farms and the people with seeds became some of the most important people in the community. And the seed catalogs went bare, the stores went bare, and all of a sudden the people who were growing their own food, they had more stability and more resiliency. And so I just hope we're able to do enough in time. And we said enough so we can bring everyone along.
I really like what
Sorry, I
you
need to
mentioned
do
there, too.
that plug there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it always comes up in every single conversation, whether through the podcast or on these panels here, the keyword relationship here, right? We've talked about how you can invite wildlife into your space and the core reason why you're farming, the possibility of doing restoration or regeneration ecologically while also earning a living and producing food, that those don't have to be in conflict. But also the attitude, the mindset of, I am not in an antagonist relationship with the other forms of life that surround and that interact with my space. And if you go into that thinking, I'm going to form some kind of symbiotic relationship with these other forms of life that are here, whether they be under the soil, whether they be in vegetative or animal form, that already sets a different baseline for how you're going to interact. And the potential from there can just grow as we talk about cultivating this ability to observe and be patient and work to understand these systems rather than to control them. Who else has got a question? And panelists, please feel free to ask each other questions as well. Let's keep the conversation going here.
There was a couple of questions about planting figs next to olives.
Yep.
I believe the reason for that is because the fig fruit is actually a flower, and the parasitic wasps for the olive fly potentially go in there and pollinate them. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's the case. I can't say that I've had any success. We don't have figs in amongst our olives. There's nowhere to put them. I would have to chop out an olive tree. And the one place we did actually have one where we lost an olive tree, the deer destroyed that last year. So that one actually disappeared. There is a few old fig trees around right next to the olives, but I don't see much difference in predation by the olive fly on the olives because of that. Maybe there's a possibility that it will help. It may be in certain situations. I'm not even fully sure that we have these parasitic wasps here because they are so tiny and very hard to find. So, yeah, I'm working with something I can't really see. It's like the microbes in the soil. You can't always see what you're working with, but you're hoping they're there and they're on your side.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned earlier was about, like, we were talking about tractor turnaround and stuff and different spaces. And I think that's like a very underutilized part of the farm design when people are looking at they're like, oh, we got this block or we got this field. And then there's all the edges and spaces in between. And when we get into a certain systematic style of production, because of efficiency, it often gets imposed on the land. And what happens then is you get, because the land has topography and slope and edge and all these things, you get these odd shapes. And they're often seen as sometimes the sacrifice areas or the places that what do I do with that? But that is actually the place where you can do these hedgerows and these perennial islands nested within your annual islands. It's like they're kind of the anchors and foundation of it. And I think incorporating and then you observe from that and I know a lot of farmers who they take those spaces to use as their kind of, as you were saying, Marcos, or you guys, or Andrew, I guess you guys are like doctor experiment. And that's what we all kind of do. But it's like you find these areas and then it's like a sketch you can do. And then it becomes a painting or more permanent. But it's like doing micro pocket forests in these little edges and see what happens and see what the relationship is. That then you might say, I'm going to test something out, see it, and then, oh, that guild of plants works really well. And I never knew that it actually needed to be on that side. It's doing so much better, the shade. I'm going to replicate that over here and do it on more of a larger scale. I'm always impressed. I am spending time over in Portugal and different places in Germany and Italy and stuff, which I am so inspired by what's happening over in Europe because of a lot of the ingenuity with like the syntropic systems, the perennial system, and like figuring out ways to take older systems and integrate new ideas. Because there is an old foundation of land management and practice, different than in North America where it's relatively new. There's still a lot of wild spaces that we're colonizing. We're like actually clearing forests to put up vineyards. It's like, wait, that's the forest. And like in Europe, it's like the vineyard's there and we're like taking it down to put up a forest. It's like this interesting thing. And I think the whole thing I'm walking away from this is, how do you take some systems and reintroduce, but then also accentuate, or what you said, the relationship, the mutually beneficial relationship, which is what we often, like in permaculture design, you often say, how can I make this relationship mutually beneficial? So not only is it have to be me, my pocketbook, the farm and stuff, but the birds and animals and soil. How is it benefiting them? It's always a good measure of question, curiosity.
I've got a question for the panelists and anybody else that might like to answer it. I was wondering I believe the farmer is actually the hero in the story of wildlife and biology and basically solving a lot of problems in the world. So there's certain places in the world where farming practices have done amazing things to incorporate wildlife, diversity, community. For example, I grew up in South Devon. We have a lot of hedgerows there because it's very windy, and also due to the Enclosures Act, where everybody had to enclose their bit of land. Farmers generally used the materials at hand, so there it was stone and soil, and then they planted a hedge on the top, or they let a hedge grow. Now that's a mini forest that runs around the edge of every field. It is managed as a hedge. It's a big hedge. It keeps animals in, and it also keeps them protected. It's also really diverse. It has 2 east sides, 2 west sides,
Amazing.
2 north and south sides. So you've got everything you can possibly think of. And I always think that's really quite diverse, even though it's quite intensive inside the fields there with animal agriculture. I was wondering, have you got any examples of when you've gone, wow, this is really quite amazing what the farmers have done here through history, or how they've formed the land, or they've done something maybe not deliberately, but there's been a positive outcome? So that's to both our panelists and possibly
You want
anybody
to go
else.
first, Marco? Yeah, I have some great examples that I'm sure you do too. I'll let you go.
I don't know if, for example, if pigs can help the olive trees, but I can tell you that the ancient olive orchard that I found here, they have pigs inside. So this just came to my mind when we were speaking about. And other things that I have noticed is that they were consociating different plants like the grapes and the olives, and they were always having plants with heavy tannin like the walnut, where they were having animals, because the tannin is a natural dewormer they were used to put these big walnut trees on the water, that long water container that people was building with bricks in the countryside. And quite often they were planting this walnut on, because when the green walnuts come into the water, they release all the tannin, and the water become extremely dark and a little bit bitter. But the animals during the beginning of at the end of the summer or whatever, they look for this for deworm themselves. So again, I think that everything goes
That's
around
cool.
our ability to understand the relations in between the creatures. I want to add just this last thing. Why monocultures are difficult to manage? Well, we were saying all together before that our actions and not actions invite other plants or animals. If we have a monoculture, who we are inviting? We are inviting simply the one that will eat that plant. We are laying the table for our parasite, because there will be anything else to eat in a clean farm where there's not even grass anymore.
Yeah.
That's this.
Thank you for those examples, Marco. Benjamin, you had a few as well?
Yeah, I think one thing Marco just said that really I've observed and understood with conventional industrial and even organic industrial is that there's a fetish or some kind of desire to control nature, right? And to control our system. And you have to have a certain mindset and personality and way of relating that allows to relinquish power. It's like a power trip that humans have or something, where they're like, they want it done a certain way, they want to do it on a certain time. There's an imposing quality, and that's when you have these monocultures and stuff. There's some perspective of and mindset of that wants that, needs that, and that maybe it's more that we've been culturally conditioned to be that way. And so there's becomes this like eco consciousness of awareness of that participation. And then sometimes you do things for one function. Like Andrew was saying, you're putting up a wall for the wind. I spent a lot of time in Ireland lately, and those hedgerows and wind, I mean, it's very impressive. You go to my son was like, yeah, these are the oldest rock walls in Europe. And I'm like, oh, really? Yeah, okay. He's like, no, I'm serious. And we were out in the Burn area. He's like, these are like 7,000 years old. And I'm like, no, they're not. And he's like, Google it. And it's like the oldest rock, they're like 7,000 years old. And you can see, and it's interesting to see like these things that were laid for one function. And then just through evolution of time and seeds dropping and soil getting collected and water moving. And these people were agrarians. They were relating to the land. These weren't haphazardly built structures like, oh, I'm just going to put a fence here. It's like there was they understood at a certain capacity, sometimes way more than I think any of us actually know. Same with the indigenous cultures. They come to these places that look like just wild spaces, and they're like incredibly intricate relational gardens that we just have no idea of the level of management, especially here in California. The California indigenous land management practices accentuated and created the largest trees on the planet, the biggest fish, the salmon, with millions of pounds of that got colonized and stripped and taken away. But it's like we're just living in the shadow of what was. And I think it's that same thing of like when we have these windows into the past and see like the A'apua'a in Hawaii, the watershed management system from the mountain to the ocean, aquaculture and the taro and everything. It was like, and the Chinampas in Mexico, these different systems. And then in Umbria, I spent a lot of time there, and also in Sicily, it's like you see these systems and you're like, wow, how do we resuscitate this? How do we participate in this? And we have all these like knowledge and skills and inoculums and seeds and things to kind of reinvent that which has been sometimes we often say this in regenerative agriculture and stuff, we're on the cutting edge of 10,000 year technology. It's like we're not inventing anything new. We're just remembering. But we also have today's circumstance. So it's not the same agriculture from 100 years ago, even though there's similar techniques and practices, it's today. So it is a regenerative agriculture specific to today. So I think it's a beautiful thing to participate in. And the examples are all around, really, in some ways. And I love that, Andrew, that you brought up those stone hedgerows, because they are like, just to think about the embodied energy too of building those systems over time. To think about building a rock wall, and then you go and you see miles and miles of rock wall. You're like, this is generations. These are pyramids. These are the ancient structures of our agrarian roots that are so valuable to acknowledge and see how we can work with them. And it's just so disheartening when you see like bulldozers come in and clear a spot for growing or for condos or housing or something. Like, oh man.
I love all these examples, and they also serve as some of my favorite inspirations as I have traveled many places in the world and continue to get to know about the agrarian histories of places here in Europe. But they were all done by people. And it's very easy to villainize human presence and the destruction that has happened recently. But I think at least the three of us here would definitely agree that we're not going to get this type of intricate and nuanced and relational land management from drones and machines that have a singular function. They may play a role, they may serve as a necessary tool for some of the things that we need to do, but I also am very much convinced that we need to bring people back into landscapes and reestablish the cultures and the relationships that came up with these types of management practices, because this was something that didn't happen purely for the efficiency of creating an output for a commodity market. These came as cultural and relational interactions with people who felt a part of the ecosystems that they participated in, and that passed these ideas and these practices and these relationships down from generations, from interactions as people moved through and cultures changed. And that's not going to come by again through simplified, mechanized forms of management. Now, there is a question here in the chat, and this one I think is relevant for a lot of people, especially one of maybe the biggest pest pressures that people deal with and don't have I haven't heard a really good solution for this yet. And the question is, do any of you know of herbs that deter wild boar? I would like to avoid fences, and I'm happy to see that the family's just hanging out on the land and fertilizing it, but I would like to discourage them from destroying the stone walls. Any insights here? Does anybody know of some management techniques that could help with wild boar?
The only thing I can add to this is that I wonder if in that area there are wolves or not. I don't know. Maybe she can tell us. Because what changes that the behavior, not just the number, the behavior of the wild boars change a lot when the predators are back. They are much more calm, less noisy, prudent, and they usually hang out a little bit less with stones or disturbing the land. But about a part of this, the only thing that deter a little bit the wild boars is the human scent. It's the only thing. For what I know, there's no herbs, there's nothing. Human scent or dogs.
Yeah, I've heard that human scent, spraying a human urine around an area. Not very pleasant, maybe, but at the edge of your field is not a problem. Potentially keep them away, but obviously it has to be done regularly. I personally use electric fence around my potatoes. We have wild boar that are coming very close to the house now, and they've moved back in the area. They've crossed the main road. So they've been here 4 years now. So I've got to accept they're here for good. And they really liked eating my worms this autumn. So they'll be back next year when the soil's moist and the worms are all on the surface in the spring, early spring. And they also seem to like organic compost and fertilizer. We've planted a few trees, and I'm not sure if it's the smell or of the compost or the manure, the pelleted manure we use, as a fertilizer, or possibly grubs in there as well. The
Yeah.
compost has quite a lot of grubs, so they're after something. If you can get them somewhere else, maybe your walls are safer. But yeah, I don't really have any solution apart from electricity.
We have wild boars over in the States as well, and they're great pigorators. They love to churn the soil up for sure. I know, I think with all wildlife, though, if you can see how you have a wildlife corridor, like we were talking about earlier, and channel it, it might not be that you get rid of it, but maybe you say, okay, I'm going to put something up. Because if they're going and then they like certain things, you kind of create some space so that they're going to go in that direction. That's one strategy you can do. And we did that on a farm because we had so many wild boar that came through, and the vineyards all around, this is in Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, they'd put so many vineyards and so many fences that the pigs were basically getting herded to our property because we were the one without the vineyard and without the fence. And so they were coming in and they were literally coming down the chute, and then they would just fan out and just wreak havoc. And we said, well, they're coming down this chute. Let's build a structure so that it puts them in that direction. It was right on top of the hill. So instead of them coming down and being able to go left or right and all over, we said, let's let them go right. And so we just took one spot where we created a fence. So then channeled them that way. And then gave them that whole side, because that was a whole side that we weren't farming or whatever. But this side we were. And in the first case, they were coming in. They would come sometimes that way and sometimes that way. We said, let's channel them that way and get them in that direction. So sometimes you can just say, well, maybe we can't get rid of them, but maybe we can direct them to a certain area.
Yeah, and that's another attitude that I really appreciate. This idea that eradication is never a real solution. Not only is it usually unfeasible and extremely expensive, even if it's possible, but as we've talked about this entire time, everything plays a role in finding an ecological balance and the diversity necessary for a healthy ecosystem that is complete and intact. And so looking at it more as a management challenge than an eradication challenge gives a new perspective and opens up new opportunities. And through observation, through patience, we might even be able to see the benefit of having them in certain spaces, or at least nearby, if not actually in the spaces that we cultivate. But that's not possible if we just look at it as how do we get rid of them, right?
Yep.
So your situation as well, only space without eucalyptus. Okay. Yeah. Monocultures and invasive species and all of that. Actually, that would be an interesting one to explore a little bit before we wrap up. We just have a little bit of time, but does anybody want to give some insights on how to manage invasive species? That is kind of another side to the coin here and is quite controversial in spaces of farming, in conservation and such. Do you make a distinction between invasive or non-native species? Do you treat it differently than other forms of wildlife around you? I see you nodding there, Marco. You want to go first?
Personally, I'm quite strict as a farmer about this. I really don't like to introduce or facilitate species that are not from the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem around me. What I see is that when you promote a healthy ecosystem, these species usually have quite a tough life. They don't grow in number. They are kept under the pressure of the main ecosystem. But if you disturb the ecosystem a little bit, or maybe something more than a little bit, they can pop up very quickly. I'm referring especially to trees at the moment, or insects. Even the worst insects, I don't know how they call is a hazelnut chimiche. I don't know the name in English, sorry. It's the parasite of the hazelnut. They are a real problem where there is a monoculture. Otherwise, you can find them, you can spot them in the fields, but they are not really dangerous. So again, I think that our focus should be on building a as much as possible, again, invite nature into our farm and build a resilient ecosystem.
Thank you, Marco. That's a great insight. Does anybody else want to add to that before we wrap up?
We've got one plant which is a little bit problematic. It's debatable whether it's invasive, but it can take over parts of the olive grove. Originally, I left it there because it had quite nice flowers. I thought, oh yeah, this has got composite ACR flowers, so it's going to be good for beneficial insects. But then it gets these really sticky seeds which get all over your clothes. They can get in the nets. They're really problematic for the animals. Most farms have some sort of weed like this. So sometimes I've hit it with a brush cutter or something, trying to remove heavily infested areas where I want to just try and control it. Otherwise, I've used the animals to control it, the sheep that we have, and they'll go and trample it and damage it a little bit. But generally, I've noticed the first few years, similar to what Benjamin was saying, that there's a real flush of this weed where it was really getting established and becoming a problem in certain areas. And now it seems to have found a bit more of an equilibrium under the trees. So it's still there and it's still a bit of a nuisance, but it's manageable. It's far more manageable than it was. And I think this is the case with most invasive species. If you can't eradicate them, they're there forever. You need to learn to live with them and manage them in a positive way, or at least reduce their impact on you.
Nice.
Yeah, and I would just say that invasive is also another way to frame that is opportunistic. And so you often have these plants that are coming in for a function. They actually have a function, and it's to cover and the soil and establish a root structure for erosion and stuff. So if we understand that when there is a disturbance or anything, there's going to be plants that'll be more opportunistic than others. And there are natives that are more pioneering species and things. And so whenever there's a disturbance, having a practice or a prescription per se of what you're going to do next. So if you are going to clear an area or do something and then you don't have a plan, or you say, oh, I'll just let nature do it, well, you're going to have often the plants that are more opportunistic. And so coming in and establishing or seeding in a very particular way at a very particular time. That's the other thing. Often we get invasive species and problems when we do things out of sync with nature's system. So it's a response mechanism that happens. And then you have the plantations and the pine and eucalyptus and things that are in for industrial thing. And so, and then they often get forgotten about, or they fire or whatever. And so it's like not seeing them as bad as much as needing some education in a sense of like, it's still the same land, it's still our environment, and they're just doing it as an extractive purpose. What are the ways that we can look long term and say, okay, when you guys are done with this, what are we going to do with this land? What are ways that we can come in and manage this or replace or work with it? Use the biomass for making biochars, essential oil. Like there's all kinds of stuff you can say, okay, let's figure out what the 50-year succession is out of these systems. Because it wasn't too long ago they weren't that.
Yeah.
Right. And so you say, okay, what is it that we can do? And what kind of nonprofit or organization are you going to start that's going to make climate farming great?
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, this is a great place to wrap up. We could definitely keep this conversation going for a while, but I really want to thank you all for your insights and for your wisdom and your examples here, and for the participants who joined us and asked such great questions in the chat as well. If you want to continue these conversations, which we always do, you can join the Climate Farmers community for free if you're an active farmer anywhere in Europe, where these conversations and many more are going on all the time with peers who are working to regenerate their land and their businesses alongside everyone else in their peer group. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you to everybody. It was a pleasure. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon.